Hello everybody, it's Saturday night. I've been reading all your posts today and want to try to tie some things up with a few explanations of theory and how it relates to research questions and where we're going in the next step in the class. And before I get into all that, I want to say that I see that everybody has posted their papers to Dropbox. I was out of town for 4 days last weekend and at the start of this week, so I'm a little bit behind in my work. I hope to have all those graded by this Tuesday, right? But I've concentrated on responding to your Module 6 post first because Module 7 that we're doing this week depends on Module 6, so I want to make sure everything's flowing good with that. All right, so I'm going to start here with the definition of theory that I got off of Merriam's on the web, I think. And the first bullet point is the main idea of theory that I am using in this class, and I think that's consistent with Creswell. That a theory is something that is intended to explain facts or events. It's an idea. Okay? And that separates it from just being a topic. So technology use in schools, for example, is not a topic. Is not a theory. Or formative assessment is not a theory. But you would have to have some kind of statement that says what those things explain. Such as formative assessment provides learners with indications of when their learning is useful and when it is not, helps them make good decisions, and therefore increases student learning. That's a theory. All right, the second definition I put not in front of because that's not the way I'm meaning it in this class, although it is something we're testing, but we're not using it as a way of saying we're not really sure. And the last one I think is something that I just want to address as not exactly. The third one is not exactly. So it's a general principle, yes, I'd agree with that, but just saying it's an idea is not enough. It has to be an idea that explains something. All right, now the next few slides I'm going to use are going to establish what I would say is the benefit of theory and why we're spending time on it. The first one is from Steve and his map that he made for Module 6. And I would say what this map shows is how theory elevates. So we could do a study on Compass Learning or any instructional program and find out that it works. But that alone would not be very interesting unless there was a theory behind it that made it make sense. And this is what the white paper from Compass Learning does, I think. It says these 5 things that Steve has mapped out here on the left are all theoretically related to student learning. And the argument is that they're built into Compass Learning, and therefore Compass Learning should increase student learning. So if we were to do a study on Compass Learning software, and we found out that it increased student learning, it might be a satisfying result because then we could connect it back to the theory. But just doing the study and finding the effect by itself is not very interesting, and we could argue that that effect, who knows what happened, maybe it was a random finding. All right, a second value of theory I'm taking from David's map, and that is it clarifies relationships so that you know what to do when you're setting up a research study. So for example, I'm going to look at teacher skill and aptitude of student in David's map. The fact that those two things are there, and they're obviously really important in this study, could clarify how you set up your research methodology if you set up an experiment. So for example, if you're comparing Compass Learning to whole group instruction, something you really don't want getting in the way of your comparison is teacher skill. Because what if all your teachers are terrible teachers? And so Compass Learning is going to come out better just because the teachers are terrible, not because Compass Learning is really a good product. So because David has this here, it really clarifies the fact that maybe if David were to write up an experimental protocol, he would want to select teachers that had comparable evaluations according to Danielson or something else that he would do. And likewise, if he were to have 2 classes of students being compared, one whole group instruction and one getting Compass Learning, he has this really important variable over here, aptitude of the student. if it turned out that one of the group's students had much higher aptitude than the other, then his whole experimental comparison is invalidated. So this is something he has to control for. And what he would likely do is set up some kind of assessment of the students before instruction has even begun to make sure that the two groups of students being compared have the same aptitude. So that's a lot of stuff that I just said, but it's all indicated by this map. And if David were to do this study and didn't take care of those things, his study would be flawed, and those would be the kind of questions that somebody at a dissertation proposal defense might be asking him, and he better have good answers for. The third thing is I'm going to take from Jamie's map, and that is similar to what I just said for David. And that's that theory clarifies, but it also clarifies some of the complications. So David's map also looked complicated, but Jamie's map here has lots of different steps to it. And I think, you know, both of them are legitimate arguments for how things actually work. But it clarifies and complicates at the same time that it explains. So theory is really, really important in research. And actually this exercise you've been going through, trying to map it out and figure out your research questions, I actually believe that doing that is the heart of being a researcher, because if you can clarify all these relationships, you really have developed a map for yourself of the things that you want to investigate, the things that you need to measure, and then you have to do all the work of actually figuring out the details. But once you have that conceptual idea, you're in really good shape. All right, now next thing I want to do is try to relate theory back to our worldviews. I'm not letting go of worldviews. All right, so we got the four worldviews, and I hope you've wondered at some point how theory might be different in the four worldviews. All right, first of all, post-positivist worldview. I think David's map is a very good map of a post-positivist kind of idea of the world. So he's got variables that are very discrete. They are one-way directional variables that cause something else or relate to something else. This leads to this, leads to this, leads to this, leads to this. Boom. Post-positivist. All right? So post-positivists believe in theories that explain things, that can be generalized, that can be tested, and where you can define variables very clearly. They usually start with a theory, like you're going to do with your experimental research, and they test it. Right? All right, that's the same thing. All right, constructivist. Now, this can be confusing if you're, for example, doing a power study and you're in a constructivist frame of reference. And where does theory come in? Because you're not doing these discrete maps in the same way that I just showed you. Well, constructivist is usually inductive. In other words, it's theory producing rather than theory testing. So you don't necessarily always start with a theory when you're doing qualitative research. You might sometimes end up with a theory. I would say that you never want to not start with a theory and not end with any kind of theory, because then you just have nothing. You're not explaining anything. But sometimes it will also start with a theory. This is another way that constructivists do it. And it tries to understand how the context of the particular situation complicates the theory and what the theory looks like in a particular context. So lots and lots of you in your posts wrote really interesting questions, like how does formative assessment relate to student learning? So that's not really an experimental question, but it's really a qualitative constructivist question, where I might give all kinds of examples of how it does in this particular context, in this particular situation. That could be an open-ended constructivist qualitative approach to research. Even when a constructivist does not start with an explicit theory of X causes Y, they usually have something that's called a conceptual framework. Right? So this is a picture of a conceptual framework.